The scent of rain-soaked earth and decay clung to the brocade curtains in the drawing-room of Ainsworth House. It was the smell of genteel poverty, a fragrance Lady Alara Ainsworth had come to know as intimately as her own breath. For months it had been the subtle perfume of their ruin, a constant reminder of her father's gambling debts, which had metastasized from a gentleman's folly into a catastrophic blight upon their name. Now it was the scent of her impending sacrifice. Across the worn Aubusson carpet, her father, Baron Ainsworth, paced with the agitated energy of a caged, fraying lion. His face, once handsome and jovial, was now a roadmap of anxiety, etched with fine lines of desperation. "He has agreed to see us, Ilara, the Duke of Blackwood himself. This is our only hope." Ilara smoothed a non-existent wrinkle in her dove-grey muslin gown, the finest she still possessed. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont. The name was a thunderclap in the drawing-rooms of London, a whispered legend of immense wealth, staggering influence, and profound, unnerving seclusion. Since the tragic death of his young wife some 5 years prior, the Duke had become a ghost, haunting his vast, remote estate on the Cornish coast. A place spoken of in hushed, fearful tones, Blackwood Manor. Even the name suggested a place devoid of light. "Why would a man like him entertain a proposal from a ruined baron?" she asked, her voice a low counterpoint to her father's frantic energy. It was a question she had asked herself 1,000 times in the sleepless nights since this desperate plan had been hatched. Her father stopped his pacing, his hands clasping and unclasping behind his back. "Because, my dear, he has something he needs, and we, by some miracle, have something he wants." "And what is that?" Ilara's heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "A duchess," her father said, the words tumbling out in a rush of shameful relief. "He has a daughter, a little girl. He requires a wife, a woman of impeccable breeding, of good name, to be a mother to the child and a mistress for his household. He has no interest in the London season, in courting debutantes. He wants a transaction, a respectable, quiet arrangement." A transaction. The word was as cold and hard as a coin. She was to be traded, her title and unsullied reputation bartered for the salvation of their family name. The shame of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Yet what was the alternative? Bailiffs at the door, their ancestral home stripped bare, her father disgraced, and her younger sister Clara cast out into a world with no prospects. Ilara's own quiet dreams of a modest, loving match, of a life filled with books and music and gentle affection, had long since turned to dust. Integrity, she had learned, was a luxury the destitute could not afford. "He is known to be difficult," she murmured, recalling the scraps of gossip she'd overheard. "A man of ice and iron. A recluse who tolerated no one, a heart locked away with the memory of his dead wife." "He is a duke," her father corrected, his tone sharp with the finality of their situation. "And he is our deliverance. You will be polite, Ilara. You will be dignified. You will be everything a future Duchess of Blackwood should be." She inclined her head, a gesture of acquiescence that felt like a betrayal of the spirited girl she had once been. "I understand, father." The journey to the Duke's London residence was a blur of grey skies and rattling carriage wheels. Ilara sat opposite her father, a silent statue, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had fortified herself, building a wall of composure brick by silent brick around her heart. She would not weep. She would not rail against the injustice of it. She would endure. It was the Ainsworth way. The Duke's townhome was a monolith of pale stone on a square so grand it seemed to sneer at the surrounding city. A severe-looking butler led them through a hall of chilling marble and into a library that seemed to absorb all sound and light. The room was vast, lined from floor to ceiling with books bound in dark leather, their gold-leaf titles gleaming like watchful eyes. A fire crackled in the grate, but it offered no warmth, its flames seeming to dance only for themselves. And then he entered. The Duke of Blackwood was taller than she had imagined, a figure of stark, imposing lines. He was dressed in black, a severe cut of coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. His hair was as dark as a raven's wing, and his face was a study in harsh, beautiful angles, a strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that looked as if it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter storm at sea, a deep, turbulent gray, and they were utterly, terrifyingly empty. They held no warmth, no curiosity, no kindness. They simply were. He gave her father a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over Ilara with an unnerving lack of interest, as if she were another piece of furniture in the room. "Lord Ainsworth, you have been punctual." His voice was a low baritone, smooth and cold as polished granite. "Your Grace?" her father stammered, bowing low. "May I present my daughter, Lady Ilara Ainsworth?" Ilara executed a flawless curtsy, her body sinking with a grace she did not feel. She kept her eyes lowered, studying the intricate pattern of the Turkish rug, waiting for his dismissal. "Your father has been forthright about your circumstances, Lady Ilara," the Duke began, his voice directly above her now. "And I, in turn, shall be forthright with you. I require a duchess. My daughter, Rosalind, needs a mother's influence, and my household requires a mistress. I am not seeking a partner for my heart, nor a companion for my evenings. I am seeking a woman of good standing to fill a vacant role." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy. Ilara remained in her curtsy, her muscles beginning to protest. The humiliation was a hot flush on her cheeks. "You will want for nothing in a material sense," he continued, his tone flat, transactional. "You will have the full protection of my name and my fortune. Your father's debts will be settled in their entirety. In return, you will manage my homes, oversee my daughter's care, and act as my hostess on the rare occasions it is required. You will have your own wing at Blackwood, your own pursuits, your own life. We need not intrude upon one another. Our lives will be parallel, not intertwined. I will expect your loyalty and discretion. I will offer you none of my own. You owe me nothing, Lady Ilara, nothing beyond the performance of your duties. Do you understand these terms? You owe me nothing." The words were meant to be a release, a strange sort of freedom within the cage of their arrangement, but they felt like the coldest chains of all. He was not just marrying her, he was erasing her, preemptively dismissing any possibility of a human connection. She was to be a ghost in his life, a well-dressed functionary, a tear threatened, hot and sharp behind her eyes, but she forced it back. She would not give him the satisfaction of her weakness. Slowly, with all the dignity she could muster, she rose from her curtsy, lifting her chin to meet his gaze for the first time. She had expected to see contempt, or at the very least, indifference. She saw only that vast, stormy emptiness. "I understand completely, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than was strictly proper, a tiny, silent rebellion, and in that moment something shifted, a flicker, a minute, almost imperceptible change in the hard set of his eyes. It was not warmth, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it was something, awareness perhaps, as if he had suddenly realized she was not a porcelain doll, but a person of flesh and blood. He had been prepared to dismiss her, to turn away and conclude the business with her father, but he didn't. Instead, as if moved by an instinct he could neither understand nor control, he did something utterly unexpected. He extended his hand. It was a simple, formal gesture, an acknowledgement, a sealing of their cold, miserable bargain. But as her smaller, gloved hand met his, a strange current passed between them. His hand was bare, and the warmth of his skin, the sheer, solid strength of his grip was a shocking contrast to the icy demeanor he presented to the world. It was a brief, fleeting contact, over in a second. He withdrew his hand almost immediately, his jaw tightening as if he regretted the impulse. But the touch lingered, a spark of warmth in the frozen landscape of her future. He took her hand, and in that single startling moment of contact, Ilara felt a sliver of something that was not despair. It was a fragile, terrifying thing so small she could barely give it a name. It was the faintest whisper of a question. Was the man of ice and iron truly made of stone all the way through? The wedding was a perfunctory affair, conducted in the Duke's private chapel with only her father, her sister Clara, and the Duke's solicitor as witnesses. Ilara wore a gown of cream-colored silk, a simple, elegant dress that felt more like a shroud than a wedding garment. Alistair stood beside her, a tall, dark spectre, his vows spoken in that same toneless baritone that had chilled her in the library. He placed a heavy gold band on her finger, his touch impersonal, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the altar. He was fulfilling a duty, nothing more. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a funereal silence. The Duke's carriage was impeccably sprung, the interior lined with dark green velvet, but Ilara felt every jolt and sway as a physical manifestation of her own unease. Alistair sat opposite her, staring out the window at the passing Cornish landscape, a rugged, beautiful tapestry of windswept moors and slate-grey cliffs that seemed to mirror his own temperament. He did not speak a single word to her for the entire 6-hour journey. Ilara watched him from beneath her lashes, studying the severe line of his profile, the way a muscle occasionally clenched in his jaw. Who was this man to whom she was now bound? What had happened to him to hollow him out so completely, to leave nothing but a shell of aristocratic duty? The gossip had spoken of a great love for his first wife, Isabel. Her death had apparently been his own. As they drew nearer to the coast, the air grew thick with the salt tang of the sea, and a persistent mist began to curl around the carriage, obscuring the world outside. It felt fitting, as if she were being delivered into a land of shadows. Finally, the carriage turned through a set of immense wrought-iron gates, the Blackwood crest, a snarling wolf's head, adorning the top. They proceeded up a long, winding drive, lined with ancient, gnarled oaks that seemed to bend and whisper in the sea wind. And then she saw it, Blackwood Manor. It was not a house, it was a fortress, a sprawling edifice of dark grey granite that seemed to rise organically from the cliff top it commanded. It was magnificent, in a brutal, imposing way, its many mullioned windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent sea below. No light shone from within, save for a few in what she presumed was the main entrance. The house did not welcome, it loomed. The carriage shuddered to a halt. A footman opened the door, and Alistair disembarked without a backward glance. Ilara gathered her skirts and followed, stepping out into the damp, chilling air. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below was a constant, mournful roar. The entire household staff was assembled in the cavernous entrance hall. A sea of black and white uniforms, their faces carefully neutral, watched as she entered on the arm of their master. An older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled into a severe grey bun stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and efficient, addressing Alistair. "Welcome home?" Then she turned her gaze to Ilara, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Davies," Alistair said, his voice echoing in the vaulted space, "this is the Duchess. You will show her to her rooms. See that she has everything she needs." It was a dismissal. He released Ilara's arm as if it had burned him and turned, striding away down a long, dark corridor without another word, his footsteps receding into the oppressive silence of the house. Ilara was left standing there, the new Duchess of Blackwood, utterly alone in a hall full of strangers. The humiliation was acute, a fresh wave of heat that prickled her skin. Mrs. Davies's expression softened fractionally. "Your Grace," she said, her tone a little less starched, "if you will follow me." She led Ilara up a grand, sweeping staircase, its banister carved from dark, polished oak. The air in the house was cold, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of a place long without laughter, without warmth. Portraits of stern-faced Beaumont ancestors watched her progress, their painted eyes seeming to judge and condemn her. "The ducal apartments are in the east wing, Your Grace," the housekeeper explained. "His Grace has kept his own rooms in the south. The West Wing is closed." The words hung in the air, freighted with unspoken meaning. The West Wing, Isabel's wing. Ilara's apartments were, in a word, palatial. A sitting room, a dressing room, a bedroom, and a boudoir, all furnished with exquisite but somber taste. Heavy damask curtains, dark wood furniture, and thick carpets that muffled all sound. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but like the one in the London Library, it seemed a lonely, isolated pocket of warmth in an ocean of cold. A young maid with wide, nervous eyes was waiting for her. "This is Martha, Your Grace," Mrs. Davies said. "She will be your personal maid." Ilara gave the girl a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you, Martha." The girl looked startled, as if a smile were a foreign currency in this house. She dropped into a hurried curtsy. After Mrs. Davies had departed, leaving behind a list of instructions and household schedules, Ilara was finally alone with Martha. The silence was unnerving. She walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. The view was breathtakingly stark, a sheer drop to a churning grey sea, the sky a seamless continuation of the same desolate color. "Does the sun ever shine here?" she asked, more to herself than to the maid. Martha, who was carefully unpacking Ilara's modest trunks, started. "Oh yes, Your Grace, when it does, it's the most beautiful place on earth. The cliffs, they turn gold, and the sea, it can be as blue as a sapphire." The girl's voice was soft, with a lilting Cornish accent. Ilara turned from the window. "Tell me about the house, Martha. About the family." Martha's hands stilled. She looked at the door, as if afraid of being overheard. "There's not much to tell, Your Grace. It's been a quiet house, a sad house, ever since the first Duchess, since the accident." "Accident?" Ilara's brow furrowed. The gossip had always been vague, speaking only of a sudden illness. The maid's eyes widened, and she pressed her lips together. "It's not my place to say, Your Grace." Ilara did not press her. She'd been here less than an hour, and she was already uncovering the secrets that lay beneath the suffocating propriety of Blackwood Manor. An accident, not an illness, a closed wing, a husband who was a walking spectre of grief. Her first dinner as Duchess was an exercise in silent misery. She was led to a dining room of baronial proportions, with a table long enough to seat 40. Alistair was already seated at its head. Ilara was placed at the opposite end, a vast expanse of polished mahogany separating them. Footmen moved like ghosts, serving course after course of impeccably prepared food that tasted of nothing. The only sounds were the clinking of silver on porcelain and the distant mournful cry of the sea. Alistair did not look at her. He ate with a mechanical precision, his gaze fixed on his plate. He was a man encased in ice, and she was trapped in his winter. Ilara felt a wave of despair so profound it was almost dizzying. What had she done? She had traded one prison for another, a cage of genteel poverty for one of gilded desolation. After the meal, which felt as if it had lasted an eternity, Alistair rose. "I trust you found your room satisfactory," he said, the words echoing in the cavernous room. It was not a question so much as a statement of fact. "They are more than satisfactory, Your Grace." "Thank you," he gave a curt nod. "I have work in my study. I bid you good night." And he was gone. Ilara sat alone at the long, empty table, the new Duchess of Blackwood, a queen with no kingdom and a wife with no husband. The weight of her new life pressed down upon her. She had sworn to endure, but as the cold silence of the great house settled around her, she wondered if survival was the same as living. She thought of his hand in hers, that brief, shocking moment of warmth. It felt like a memory from another lifetime. Here, in the heart of his kingdom of ice, such warmth seemed an impossible, fanciful dream. The days at Blackwood Manor bled into one another, a uniform grey tapestry of routine and silence. Ilara quickly learned the rhythm of the house, which was governed by the quiet efficiency of Mrs. Davies and the unspoken, sorrowful will of its master. She saw the Duke only at dinner, where their silent, ridiculously distant meals continued. During the day, he was a phantom, sequestered in his study or riding out across the moors, a solitary dark figure against the brooding landscape. Ilara's duties, as outlined by the housekeeper, were minimal at first. She reviewed menus, approved household expenditures, and answered the few letters that arrived, all under the watchful though not unkind eye of Mrs. Davies. She was a figurehead, a name in a ledger, not yet a true mistress of the house. The staff were deferential but distant, their loyalty clearly belonging to the memory of the first Duchess. It was on the fourth day that she finally met the reason for her presence here. She was in the morning room trying to lose herself in a book of poetry when a small sound from the hallway caught her attention. Peeking out, she saw a tiny figure in a black dress, a whisper of a child half hidden behind the legs of a stern-looking governess. The child had a riot of dark, curly hair, so like the Duke's, but her eyes, wide and startled, were a deep, sorrowful blue. This had to be Rosalind. The governess, a woman with a face like pinched parchment named Miss Finch, guided the child forward with a firm hand on her shoulder. "Lady Rosalind, you will greet the Duchess." The little girl, who looked to be about 5 years old, stared at Ilara with an unnerving intensity. There was no childlike curiosity in her gaze, only a profound, weary sadness that seemed far too heavy for such a small frame. She executed a wobbly curtsy, her eyes never leaving Ilara's face. "Good morning, Lady Rosalind," Ilara said, her voice gentle. She knelt down, hoping to appear less intimidating. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you. I am Ilara." The child said nothing. She simply stared, her small lips pressed into a thin, unmoving line. "She is a shy child, Your Grace," Miss Finch said, her tone clipped and disapproving, as if Rosalind's silence were a personal failing. "And she is still in mourning, of course." Still in mourning after 5 years? Ilara looked at the child's black dress, at the somber, joyless expression on her face. It was as if the entire house, and everyone in it, was caught in a perpetual state of grief, frozen at the moment of the first Duchess's death. "Perhaps she would like to show me the gardens," Lara suggested, keeping her tone light. Miss Finch sniffed. "The gardens are not in a fit state for viewing, Your Grace. They have been neglected." Ilara spent the next few weeks trying to breach the wall of silence around her new stepdaughter. She would join her in the nursery, offering to read stories or play with her dolls. Rosalind would sit silently, allowing Ilara to read, but never responding, never showing a flicker of interest. Her silence was not defiant. It was hollow. It was the silence of a child who had learned that there was no point in speaking, for there was no one to hear. Miss Finch was a constant, oppressive presence, her methods of child-rearing seemingly rooted in the suppression of all emotion and joy. Ilara observed her interactions with Rosalind with a growing sense of unease. The governess was not cruel, not precisely, but she was cold and rigid, her praise as rare and sterile as her smiles. Frustrated by her lack of progress with Rosalind and suffocated by the endless silent corridors of the manor, Ilara began to explore the grounds. The estate was vast and wild, the formal lawns near the house giving way to rugged coastal paths and windswept heath. It was on one of these walks that she found it, tucked away behind a high stone wall, its gate choked with ivy, was the garden Miss Finch had mentioned. It was not just neglected, it was a ruin, a ghost of a garden. Weeds grew thick and tangled, strangling what had once been carefully tended flower beds. A stone fountain in the center was dry and cracked, filled with dead leaves. Rose bushes, thorny and overgrown, clawed at the air like skeletal hands. Yet, even in its desolation, she could see the beauty of its design. The elegant sweep of the paths, the classical arrangement of the beds, the crumbling stone benches placed in just the right spots to catch the morning sun. It had been a place of love, a place of peace. She found the head gardener, a weathered old man named Mr. Hemlock, his hands as gnarled as the oak trees he tended. When she asked him about the walled garden, his face clouded over. "That was her ladyship's garden, your grace," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. "The first duchess. Tended it with her own hands, she did. Loved her roses more than anything. After she was gone, his grace ordered it locked, said he couldn't bear to look at it. Here was another locked piece of the duke's heart, left to wither and die. An idea began to form in Ilara's mind, a quiet, purposeful rebellion against the suffocating grief of this house. It was a presumptuous, audacious thought, but it took root and refused to be dislodged. She would bring the garden back to life. She returned to Mr. Hemlock the next day. "I wish to restore the rose garden," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. The old gardener stared at her as if she had grown a second head. "But, your grace, the Duke has given me charge of this household," Ilara said with a confidence she did not entirely feel. "And a garden is part of a household. It needs tending. We will start tomorrow." Mr. Hemlock hesitated, then a slow, creaky smile spread across his face. It was the first genuine smile she had seen since her arrival. "As you wish, your grace." So began her project. Every morning, after her perfunctory breakfast, Ilara would change into a simple old dress she had brought from home and make her way to the walled garden. At first, she simply watched as Mr. Hemlock and a young garden boy began the arduous task of clearing the weeds and debris. But soon the desire to feel the earth in her own hands became too strong. She donned a pair of thick gloves and began to work alongside them, pulling at stubborn ivy, trimming the dead wood from the roses, her back aching and her hands growing calloused. The physical labor was a balm to her troubled spirit. In the garden, she was not the ornamental Duchess of Blackwood. She was just Ilara, a woman coaxing life from neglect. Each cleared bed, each pruned branch, felt like a small victory against the oppressive sorrow of the manor. Martha was scandalized at first. "Your grace, your hands! What will his grace say?" "His grace will say nothing because he will not notice," Ilara replied, smiling as she washed the dirt from beneath her nails. "And even if he does, what of it? A duchess is not made of glass." Slowly, painstakingly, the garden began to re-emerge from its coffin of weeds. The clean lines of the paths reappeared. The fountain was cleared and scrubbed. Mr. Hemlock, his initial reluctance replaced by a fierce protective pride in their shared project, declared that many of the old roses, the ones planted by the first Duchess, could be saved. One afternoon, as Ilara was kneeling in the dirt, carefully tying a rambling rose to a trellis, she felt a presence behind her. She looked up, shading her eyes against the pale sun, and her heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt. It was the Duke. He was standing by the newly cleared gate, watching her. His face was, as always, an unreadable mask, but his stillness was charged with an intensity that made the air crackle. She did not know how long he had been standing there. She felt a flush of defiance, mixed with a strange, nervous vulnerability. She was covered in dirt, her hair escaping its pins, her dress stained with earth. She was not the poised, untouchable Duchess she was supposed to be. Slowly she rose to her feet, wiping her soiled hands on her apron. She met his gaze across the slowly reviving garden, her chin held high. She expected a reprimand, a cold, cutting remark about the unseemliness of her behavior. He said nothing for a long moment, his stormy grey eyes sweeping over the garden, taking in the cleared paths, the pruned roses, the piles of weeds. He looked at her dirt-streaked face and calloused hands. Then he spoke. His voice was low, and for the first time, it held a note of something other than cold indifference. It was a rough, incredulous sound. "You have been busy." It was not praise, not precisely, but it was not condemnation either. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of her existence, of her will, of her impact on his frozen world. He turned then and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of her nascent garden, her heart beating a wild, unsteady rhythm against her ribs. He had noticed, and in his notice, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. The Duke's brief, unexpected appearance in the garden marked a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor. It was not a thaw, not yet, but perhaps the first cracking of the ice. He did not mention the garden again, but Ilara felt his awareness of it, a silent observation from the windows of his study that overlooked the grounds. She continued her work, her purpose renewed. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could impose order and beauty on at least one small corner of her disordered life. Her efforts with Rosalind continued to be met with the child's persistent, heartbreaking silence. Ilara began to suspect that Miss Finch was part of the problem. The governess seemed to resent Ilara's presence, viewing her attempts to connect with Rosalind as an intrusion on her authority. She would often interrupt their time together with a sharp reminder of lessons or schedules, whisking the child away just as Ilara felt she might be making the smallest amount of progress. One rainy afternoon, with work in the garden impossible, Ilara sought out Rosalind in the nursery. She found the little girl sitting by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, her expression one of utter desolation. Miss Finch was nowhere to be seen. Ilara entered quietly and sat in a small chair near the child. For a long while they sat in silence, simply watching the rain together. "When I was a little girl," Ilara said softly, not looking at Rosalind but at the window, "I used to imagine that the raindrops were racing each other down the pane. I would pick one at the very top and cheer for it all the way down." She pointed a finger at the glass. "See that one? It's a very fast one. I think he shall win." She watched from the corner of her eye as Rosalind's gaze followed her finger. The child's expression did not change, but her attention was captured. For the next few minutes, Ilara provided a quiet, running commentary on the raindrop race, her voice calm and soothing. Then she had an idea. She went to the nursery bookshelf, which was filled with dry moralistic tales chosen by Miss Finch. Pushing them aside, she found what she was looking for, a worn copy of a book of fairy tales, its spine cracked and its pages softened with use. It must have been the first Duchess's. "Shall I read you a story, Rosalind?" she asked gently. "It's about a princess who was turned into a swan." Rosalind did not answer, but she did not turn away. She simply watched as Ilara opened the book. Ilara began to read, her voice adopting different tones for the characters, from the evil sorcerer to the brave prince. She poured all her own loneliness and longing into the story of the lost princess. She was halfway through the tale when she heard it, a tiny, almost inaudible sound. It was a sniffle. Ilara paused and looked at Rosalind. The little girl's lower lip was trembling, and a single large tear was tracing a path down her pale cheek. It was the first real emotion Ilara had seen from her. Instinctively, Ilara reached out, not to touch the child, but simply to offer her a handkerchief. Rosalind flinched at the movement, but took the small piece of linen, dabbing at her eye with a clumsy, childlike motion. At that moment, Miss Finch swept into the room. "What is going on here? Lady Rosalind, crying is a sign of weakness. You will compose yourself at once." Ilara stood up, her gentle demeanor vanishing, replaced by a cool authority she hadn't known she possessed. "She is a child, Miss Finch, not a soldier, and she is allowed to have feelings. Leave us." The governess looked utterly scandalized. "Your Grace, I am her governess. I know what is best for—" "I said leave us," Ilara repeated, her voice low but steel-edged. For a moment the two women locked gazes, a silent battle of wills. Then, with a look of pure venom, Miss Finch turned on her heel and departed, closing the door with a sharp click. Ilara turned back to Rosalind. The child was staring at her, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Awe. No one had ever contradicted Miss Finch in her presence before. Ilara sat back down and picked up the book. "Now, where were we? Ah, yes. The Swan Princess was just about to meet the prince by the enchanted lake." She finished the story, and when she was done, Rosalind was still silent. But it was a different kind of silence. It was watchful, thoughtful. As Ilara stood to leave, a tiny hand reached out and brushed her sleeve, a touch as light as a moth's wing. It was the first time the child had initiated any physical contact. Ilara's heart swelled. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt like a monumental victory. That evening at dinner, the Duke seemed different. He was still quiet, but the rigid set of his shoulders was slightly relaxed. He looked at her, truly looked at her, several times across the vast expanse of the table. "Miss Finch tells me you dismissed her from the nursery today," he said, his voice neutral. Ilara's stomach tightened. She had overstepped. "I did, Your Grace." "Why?" She chose her words carefully. "Lady Rosalind was upset. I felt she needed comfort, not criticism." He contemplated this for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "Rosalind has not shed a tear since her mother's funeral. The physicians called it A prolonged state of shock. They said it was unhealthy. He looked up, and his grey eyes were not empty now. They were filled with a deep, painful conflict. Thank you. Ilara was so stunned. She could not immediately reply. He had thanked her, he had approved of her actions, he had sided with her against a long-standing member of his staff. The next day, Miss Finch was gone. Mrs. Davies informed Ilara with a discreet lack of detail that the governess had been dismissed and a generous severance provided. The Duke had done it without consulting Ilara, a swift, decisive action that spoke volumes. He was beginning to trust her. He was beginning to see her not just as a functionary, but as an ally in the care of his daughter. The change in Rosalind without Miss Finch's oppressive presence was gradual but miraculous. The silence began to recede, replaced by hesitant questions. Her first word to Ilara was a whispered "more" when Ilara finished a story. Soon she was pointing at pictures in the books, her small voice growing stronger with each passing day. One bright, sunny afternoon, Ilara took her to the now recovering garden. The roses were beginning to bud, tight green fists promising a future flush of color. Mr. Hemlock had repaired the fountain, and the sound of trickling water filled the air. Your grandmamma loved this garden, Ilara told the little girl, taking her hand. Rosalind's fingers curled trustingly around her own. She planted all of these roses herself. Rosalind looked around, her eyes wide with wonder. She pointed to a particularly large bush with deep crimson buds. Mama? She asked, her voice a soft query. Yes, darling, Ilara said, her throat tightening with emotion. This was your mamma's. Rosalind reached out a tentative finger and touched one of the velvety buds. And then, for the first time since Ilara had arrived at Blackwood, the little girl smiled. It was a small, watery smile, but it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. It transformed her sad little face, giving a glimpse of the happy child she was meant to be. At that moment, a shadow fell over them. Ilara looked up to see the Duke standing at the entrance to the garden, just as he had before, but this time his eyes were not on her. They were fixed on his daughter. He was watching Rosalind smile, and the expression on his face was one of raw, unguarded astonishment. It was as if he were seeing a ghost, a beloved memory brought back to life. The mask of cold indifference had shattered, and in its place was a look of such profound, heart-wrenching vulnerability that Ilara had to look away. He had built his fortress of ice to protect himself from this very feeling, from the pain of memory and the hope of new joy. And now she and his daughter, in this garden of resurrected beauty, had breached his defenses. He did not speak. He simply watched for a moment longer, his face a maelstrom of emotions he quickly tried to conceal. Then he turned and strode back towards the house, his retreat as swift and silent as his arrival. But Ilara knew that something fundamental had broken open. The first, true glimmer of warmth had pierced the heart of Blackwood, and she had been the one to kindle it. The weeks that followed were marked by a tentative, fragile peace. The Duke maintained his distance, yet the quality of his silence had changed. It was no longer a wall of cold indifference, but something more complex, more watchful. Ilara would sometimes catch him looking at her across the dinner table, his expression thoughtful, almost questioning, before he would retreat once more behind his stony facade. Rosalind, however, was blossoming. With Ilara as her near-constant companion, the little girl's world began to expand beyond the grey walls of the nursery. They walked the coastal paths together, collected shells on the small private beach below the manor, and spent hours in the rose garden, which was now preparing for a riot of summer color. Rosalind's laughter, once a sound as rare as a unicorn, began to echo in the long, silent corridors, a sweet, clear melody that chipped away at the house's sorrowful heart. Ilara found a quiet contentment in her new life. She had a purpose. She was needed. The love she felt for the lonely little girl was fierce and protective, a warmth that filled the empty spaces in her own heart. If this was to be the extent of her happiness, a child to care for, and a garden to tend, then perhaps, she thought, it would be enough. Her quiet world was shattered by the arrival of a letter bearing a formidable crest. It announced the impending visit of Lady Beatrice Beaumont, the Duke's aunt. Mrs. Davies's lips thinned as she informed Ilara. Lady Beatrice comes every year for the anniversary, she said, her voice low. She is a woman of strong opinions. The undercurrent of warning was impossible to miss. Lady Beatrice arrived like a galleon in full sail, a formidable woman swathed in black bombazine and jet beads, her face a mask of aristocratic disapproval. She was Alistair's late mother's sister, and she carried herself with the unassailable authority of one who had known the family in its happier days. Her assessment of Ilara was swift and brutal. Her cold eyes swept over Ilara's simple afternoon gown with barely concealed contempt. So, she said, her voice as sharp as splintered ice, you are the replacement. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face, but she held her ground, inclining her head with a cool dignity. I am the Duchess of Blackwood, Lady Beatrice. It is a pleasure to welcome you to our home. The visit was an immediate and unmitigated disaster. Lady Beatrice treated Ilara with a thinly veiled disdain, making pointed remarks about her family's unfortunate circumstances and questioning her every decision regarding the household. She was a walking, talking embodiment of the societal judgment Ilara had feared, but her cruelest attacks were centered on Rosalind. "The child is running wild, Alistair," she declared at dinner that evening, ignoring Ilara completely. "I saw her today with dirt on her dress. Isabel would be horrified. Isabel knew how to raise a proper lady." Alistair, who had been even more withdrawn and silent since his aunt's arrival, merely clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on his plate. Lady Beatrice saw his silence as an invitation to continue. "And this obsession with that garden. It is morbid. You should have had it ploughed under years ago. It is unhealthy to dwell on the past." Ilara could not remain silent. "The garden is a place of beauty, Lady Beatrice, and Rosalind finds great joy in it. I see no harm in that." Lady Beatrice turned her glacial stare on Ilara. "You, madam, would not understand. You did not know my niece. You did not know the light that was extinguished from this house. You are a stranger here, a convenience. Do not presume to speak of joy in a house of mourning." The attack was so direct, so vicious, that it stole the breath from Ilara's lungs. She looked to Alistair for support, for any sign that he would defend her, but he remained silent, a stone statue at the head of the table, lost in his own private torment. The anniversary of his wife's death was clearly a time of profound pain for him, and his aunt's presence only seemed to amplify it. The next day, a storm rolled in from the sea, mirroring the tempest inside the manor. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the granite walls like a grieving spirit. Ilara found Rosalind in the nursery, looking pale and frightened. Lady Beatrice was with her. "And so you see," the old woman was saying in a low, poisonous tone, "your new mother is not your real mother. Your real mother is an angel in heaven, watching you, and she is very sad when you forget her." Rosalind's face was ashen, her lower lip trembling. She was clutching a small porcelain doll that Ilara recognized from a portrait of the first Duchess. Ilara's protective instinct surged, a wave of hot fury. "That is enough, Lady Beatrice." The old woman turned, a triumphant, malicious glint in her eyes. "I am merely reminding the child of her heritage." "You are tormenting her," Ilara shot back, her voice shaking with rage. She knelt before Rosalind, taking the child's cold hands in her own. "Rosalind, darling, listen to me. Loving someone new does not mean you are forgetting your mama. A heart is a very big place. There is room for all the people we love, both the ones who are here and the ones who are in heaven." Rosalind looked from Ilara to her great-aunt, her small face a mask of confusion and fear. "Do not fill her head with such nonsense," Lady Beatrice snapped. "She is a Beaumont. She must understand her duty, her legacy of grief." "She is a child," Ilara cried, her voice rising. "She deserves a childhood, not a legacy of grief." The argument was interrupted by the sound of the nursery door opening. The Duke stood on the threshold, his face a thundercloud, darker than the storm raging outside. He had heard everything. His gaze was like a physical force, sweeping over the scene, his aunt triumphant and cruel, Ilara defiant and protective, and his daughter weeping silently between them. He walked into the room, his presence sucking all the air from it. He did not look at Ilara. He did not look at his daughter. His stormy eyes were fixed on his aunt. "Beatrice," he said, his voice terrifyingly quiet, "you will pack your things. My carriage will take you to the station in 1 hour." Lady Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to the jet beads at her throat. "Alistair, how dare you? I am your family. I came here for Isabel's memory." "Isabel," he said, the name a shard of glass in his mouth, "was a woman of kindness and light. She would have despised what you are doing in her name. You are using her memory as a weapon to wound a child. You will not do it again in my house, ever." He then turned and knelt before his daughter, his movements stiff, unpracticed. He gently took the doll from her hands. "Your mother would want you to be happy, Rosalind, above all else." He looked up, and his eyes met Ilara's over the child's head. In their depths she saw a maelstrom of pain, gratitude, and a raw, desperate apology. It was the most he had ever communicated to her without words. He stood and offered Ilara his hand, helping her to her feet. It was the first time he had touched her since their wedding day. His grip was firm, solid, a silent acknowledgement of their alliance. "See to Rosalind," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will deal with my aunt." He turned and left the room, his purpose clear and unassailable. A moment later, they heard his voice, low and commanding, in the hallway, followed by the indignant squawking of Lady Beatrice. Ilara was left with the sobbing child. She gathered Rosalind into her arms, holding her tight, murmuring soothing words as the storm outside raged and the storm inside the house finally, violently broke. She had been tested, and she had not been found wanting, and in the heart of the crisis, the Duke of Blackwood, the man of ice and iron, had stood with her. He had defended her. He had chosen her. And in that choice, everything had changed. The departure of Lady Beatrice left a vacuum in the house, a ringing silence where her sharp, critical voice had been. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp with the scent of rain and salt. But inside Blackwood Manor, a different kind of storm had just begun to recede, leaving its master emotionally raw and exposed. Alistair did not appear for dinner. He sent word via a footman that he was not hungry and did not wish to be disturbed. Ilara ate her solitary meal in the vast dining room, the silence feeling heavier than ever. The victory over Lady Beatrice felt hollow, overshadowed by the profound sorrow that had driven the confrontation. She had seen behind the Duke's mask today, glimpsed the tormented man beneath, and the sight had been devastating. After ensuring Rosalind was sound asleep, her tear-stained face peaceful against her pillow, Ilara felt a restless energy she could not quell. The house felt suffocating, each shadow seeming to hold a memory, each gust of wind sounding like a sigh. She found herself drawn to his study, a place she had never dared to enter. A thin sliver of light shone from beneath the heavy oak door. Hesitantly she knocked. There was no answer. She knocked again, more firmly this time. "Go away," a voice from within growled. It was thick, slurred, as if with drink. Ilara's hand fell from the door. She should leave. He had made his wishes clear. It was not her place. Theirs was an arrangement, a contract. His private grief was not part of their bargain. But the memory of his eyes, that maelstrom of pain and gratitude she had seen in the nursery, held her rooted to the spot. She could not walk away. Taking a steadying breath, she turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the door open. The room was in chaos. Books were pulled from shelves, papers were strewn across the floor. An empty decanter of brandy stood on the desk, another nearly empty beside it. Alistair was slumped in a large leather armchair by the cold hearth, his head in his hands. He did not look up as she entered. "I told you to go away," he mumbled into his hands. Ilara closed the door softly behind her, shutting them into the cocoon of the room. "You need not speak," she said, her voice quiet, "but you should not be alone." He gave a harsh, bitter laugh that was more like a sob. "I have been alone for 5 years. I prefer it." She walked further into the room, her slippers silent on the thick carpet. She stood a few feet from his chair, a still, calm presence in the midst of his self-inflicted storm. She did not speak, did not offer platitudes or empty comforts. She simply waited. For a long time the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the ragged sound of his breathing. Finally he lifted his head. His face was ravaged, his usually immaculate hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a pain so vast it seemed to have no end. "Do you know what day it is tomorrow?" he asked, his voice a raw rasp. "I do," she said softly. "The anniversary." He stared into the empty fireplace, as if seeing scenes from the past play out in the soot-stained bricks. 5 years. 5 years since I destroyed everything I ever loved." "You did not destroy it," Ilara whispered. "It was an accident." Martha's words from her first day came back to her. He looked at her then, his eyes focusing on her with a terrible clarity. "An accident, is that what they call it? An accident? Born of my pride, my selfishness." He surged to his feet, pacing the room with a caged, desperate energy. "We had argued, a stupid, meaningless argument about a political dinner in London I insisted we attend. She hated London. She loved it here. She loved her garden, the sea. She wanted us to stay, just the 3 of us." He stopped, his back to her, his hand gripping the mantelpiece so tightly his knuckles were white. "I was arrogant, a duke with duties. I told her place was by my side. I said things, cruel things. I left for my ride in a temper without saying goodbye." He fell silent, his shoulders shaking. Ilara's heart ached for him, a deep, resonant pain. "She was coming to me," he continued, his voice cracking. "The groom told me later. She had ordered the carriage, told him she was going to ride out to the moors to find me, to make peace. She couldn't bear for the sun to set on our anger." He turned to face her, his face a mask of self-loathing. The horses were new, spirited. The ground was wet from a morning shower, the carriage overturned at the old stone bridge. She was gone before they could get her back to the house. The story fell into the silent room, brutal and heavy. The locked west wing, the neglected garden, the perpetual mourning, it all snapped into a terrible, coherent focus. His coldness wasn't just grief, it was guilt, a guilt so profound it had poisoned every aspect of his life. My aunt is right, he said, his voice dropping to a desolate whisper. I should have ploughed the garden under. Every time a rose blooms, it feels like a judgment, a reminder of what she loved, of what I took from her. Ilara finally moved, closing the distance between them. She stood before him, looking up into his tortured face. You are wrong, she said, her voice firm with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. Every blooming rose is not a judgment. It is a testament. It is proof that life continues, that beauty can grow again, even after the most terrible winter. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a moment before she laid it gently on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath his coat, coiled tight with years of unshed grief. He flinched at her touch, but did not pull away. You have been punishing yourself, Alistair, she said, using his given name for the first time. It felt both strange and perfectly natural on her tongue. You have been living in a tomb of your own making. But Isabel is not in that closed wing. Her memory isn't in a dead garden. It's in Rosalind's smile. It's in the beauty she created. You don't honor her by letting it all turn to dust. You honor her by letting it live. He stared down at her, his stormy eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. The brandy, the years of solitude, the raw emotion of the day had stripped away all his defenses. He was no longer the cold, imposing duke. He was just a man, broken by a grief he felt he did not deserve to heal from. Slowly, as if it were the heaviest thing in the world, he lifted his hand and covered hers, his fingers curling around her own. His skin was warm, his grip strong, just as she remembered from that first day in the library, a silent, desperate connection. How? He whispered, the word a ragged plea. How do I let it live? You have already begun, she answered, her voice soft but sure. You let Rosalind laugh. You defended her. You defended me. You let a little bit of light back in. You just have to be brave enough not to shut the door again. He did not speak, but he did not release her hand. They stood there for a long time in the disordered study, surrounded by the wreckage of his past, the clock ticking off the final moments of the anniversary eve. The first rays of dawn were beginning to pierce the darkness outside, casting a pale, hopeful light into the room. For the first time in 5 years, the Duke of Blackwood was not facing the dawn of this terrible day alone. He was holding her hand, and in that simple, profound connection, the long, cold winter of his heart finally began to thaw. The morning after the confession was quiet and surreal. Ilara woke with a sense of trepidation, wondering if the night before had been a dream, a strange hallucination brought on by brandy and emotional exhaustion. She half expected to find the Duke restored to his former icy state, the walls of his fortress rebuilt, higher and stronger than ever. When she went down for breakfast, she was surprised to find him already in the dining room. He was not at his usual distant post at the head of the table, but was seated much closer to her place. He looked tired, the lines of strain still etched around his eyes, but the raw, self-destructive despair was gone. In its place was a quiet, fragile solemnity. Good morning, he said, his voice low and a little rough. He met her eyes directly, and there was no coldness in them, only a deep, weary gratitude. Good morning, Your Grace, she replied softly. Alistair, he corrected her gently. My name is Alistair. A small, momentous shift. A footman entered to serve them, and they fell into a comfortable silence, the air between them no longer charged with tension, but with a shared, unspoken understanding. Later that morning he found her in the garden. She was showing Rosalind how to deadhead the spent rose blooms to encourage new growth. The child was chattering away, a constant, happy stream of questions and observations. Alistair stood by the fountain, watching them. He did not look like an intruder in this space anymore. He looked as if he were trying to find his way home. She looks like her mother when she smiles, he said, his voice quiet, filled with a gentle melancholy rather than the sharp pain of before. She is a happy child, Ilara said, smiling at Rosalind, who was now carefully examining a ladybug on a leaf. Because of you, he stated, a simple, profound acknowledgement. I kept her in mourning with me. I see that now. I trapped her in my own grief. You did what you thought was right, Ilara said, offering him the grace he could not yet offer himself. You protected your heart. And hers, he shook his head, a gesture of self-reproach. I starved it. He looked around at the garden, at the vibrant pinks, deep reds, and creamy whites of the blooming roses. You brought this back to life. I would not have thought it possible. It was always here, she said, just waiting for someone to clear away the weeds. The symbolism was not lost on him. His gaze lingered on her face, and in his eyes she saw the dawn of a new emotion, something tender and uncertain that made her own heart beat a little faster. In the days that followed, The transformation of their lives was quiet but profound. Alistair began to join her and Rosalind for their afternoon walks. At first he was a silent observer, but gradually he began to participate. He would answer Rosalind's questions about the seabirds or point out a ship on the horizon. He started to smile, small tentative smiles that at first seemed to cause him pain, but soon came more naturally. He was a man slowly, cautiously learning to live again. Their dinners were no longer silent ordeals. He moved his seat permanently to be closer to hers. And they spoke of books, of the estate, of the news from London. He discovered her sharp intellect and quiet wit, and she discovered the thoughtful, knowledgeable man who had been buried beneath the Duke's icy persona. She learned he had a passion for history and architecture, that he worried about the plight of the tenant farmers on his land, that he possessed a deep, abiding love for the wild Cornish coast. One evening, as they sat in the library, a room she now entered with ease, a comfortable silence fell between them as they read by the fire. Ilara looked up from her book to find him watching her, an expression of intense concentration on his face. "What is it?" she asked, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "I am trying to understand something," he said, closing his own book. "I entered into this marriage as a matter of cold, practical necessity. I offered you nothing. I gave you a half-life in a house of shadows. Yet you have given me everything. You have given me back my daughter. You are giving me back myself. Why, Ilara? Why have you shown such kindness to a man who showed you none?" The question was raw, vulnerable. He was asking her to explain herself, to explain the compassion that had so thoroughly undone him. Ilara thought for a moment, choosing her words with care. "When I came here, I saw a house in pain," she said, "and I saw a lonely little girl who deserved a chance at happiness. I did not do it for you, not at first. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because no house should be without laughter, and no child should be without love." She paused, her gaze dropping to the fire. "And perhaps I was lonely too." He rose from his chair and came to kneel before hers, taking her hands in his. The gesture was so full of humility and reverence that it took her breath away. "My arrangement was a fool's bargain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I asked for a duchess, and fate gave me a savior. Ilara," he searched her face, his grey eyes luminous in the firelight. "Is it possible, after all this, that you could ever see me as more than the cold-hearted jailer you were shackled to?" Her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was it, the turning point she had never dared to dream of. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, to the warmth of his hands holding hers, to the question hanging in his eyes. "I have not seen that man in a very long time," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. It was the first true, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, and it was devastatingly beautiful. It lit his face from within, chasing away the last of the shadows. He leaned forward, his intention clear, his movements hesitant, as if asking for permission. Ilara gave it, her eyes fluttering closed as he gently, tenderly pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of deep, profound gratitude and burgeoning hope. It was soft, searching, a question and an answer all in one. It spoke of shared sorrow and the promise of future joy. It was the taste of salt from the sea and the warmth of the fire, a sealing of a new pact, one made not of duty and convenience, but of affection and respect. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her cheek. "The West Wing," he murmured. "I will have Mrs. Davies open it tomorrow. It is time for the sun to come in." It was more than just opening a set of rooms. It was an act of surrender. He was letting go of the ghost that had haunted him, not to forget, but to finally live again. He was choosing the future. He was choosing her, and in the warm, firelit library of Blackwood Manor, Ilara knew that she had found not just a sanctuary, but a home. The opening of the West Wing was a symbolic and deeply moving affair. Ilara stood with Alistair at the end of the long, dust-sheeted corridor as Mrs. Davies, her face a mixture of solemnity and relief, turned a large iron key in the lock. The door swung open with a protesting groan, revealing a hallway shrouded in white linen, a ghostly landscape of furniture frozen in time. Alistair took a deep, shuddering breath and took Ilara's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Together," he said, more to himself than to her. They walked through the silent rooms, pulling back the dust covers one by one. Sunlight, rich and golden, streamed through the tall windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust. It was not a sad place, Ilara realized. The rooms were light and airy, decorated in pale blues and creams. There were watercolor paintings on the walls, and a beautiful pianoforte stood in the corner of the sitting room. It was a place that had once been filled with life and music. In the bedroom, A magnificent portrait hung over the fireplace. It was of a young woman with dark curly hair and joyful blue eyes, an older version of Rosalind, Isabel. She was beautiful, vibrant, and smiling, not with the posed formality of a portrait, but with genuine, infectious happiness. Alistair stood before it for a long time, his hand tightening on Ilara's. "I was afraid to look at her," he confessed in a low voice. "I thought it would bring back all the guilt, all the pain, but now I just see the woman I loved, and I feel peace." He turned to Ilara, his eyes clear. "She would have liked you, Ilara. She would have admired your strength, your kindness. She would have been grateful to you for loving our daughter." It was the final absolution he needed to grant himself. That afternoon, he took Ilara to a small private cove hewn out of the cliffs below the manor. The sea was a brilliant sapphire, the sun warm on their faces. They sat on a smooth, sun-warmed rock, watching the waves roll in. "When I proposed our arrangement," Alistair began, his gaze on the horizon, "I told you that you owed me nothing." He turned to her, his expression serious, his heart in his eyes. "I was a fool. I see that now. I bound you to a life of service and silence, and you gave it light and sound. The debt is all mine, Ilara, and it is a debt I can never hope to repay." "There is no debt between us, Alistair," she said softly, laying her hand on his arm. "Then let there be a promise," he said, his voice growing in intensity. He took both her hands in his, turning to face her fully. "Let me start again, not as a duke seeking a convenience, but as a man who has, against all odds, been given a second chance at happiness." He slid from the rock onto one knee in the sand, a gesture so earnest and unexpected it made her gasp. "Lady Ilara Ainsworth," he said, his voice clear and strong above the sound of the waves, "you came into my life and showed me that a heart can heal, that a house can be a home again, and that love is not a memory to be guarded, but a living, breathing thing to be nurtured. I love you with a depth of gratitude and admiration that I cannot properly express. I am asking you now not to be my duchess, but to be my wife, in truth, in every way that matters. Will you marry me, Ilara, again?" Tears welled in her eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She saw before her not the cold, imposing duke from the London Library, but a man made whole by love and forgiveness, a man she had, against all her own expectations, come to love with all her heart. "Yes," she whispered, the word carried away on the sea breeze. "Yes, Alistair, I will." He rose and drew her into his arms, his kiss no longer tentative, but sure and deep and filled with all the promises of their future. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sunrises and quiet evenings, of laughter echoing in hallways, of a family forged not by contract, but by a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of gardens. The change in Blackwood Manor was palpable. The staff, who had watched the slow miracle of the Duke's transformation, now moved with a lighter step, their faces open and smiling. The West Wing was aired and cleaned, its rooms once again part of the living house. Alistair would sometimes play the pianoforte in the evenings, filling the halls with beautiful, melancholic melodies that were no longer just sad, but full of a complex, hopeful beauty. Rosalind was the truest barometer of their happiness. She was a different child entirely, bright, inquisitive, and secure in the love of the two people she called Mama and Papa. To see her running through the garden, her dark curls flying, her laughter carried on the wind, with Alistair chasing her, a smile of pure paternal adoration on his face, was to witness a scene of perfect, hard-won joy. Their declaration on the beach was not the end of their story, but the true beginning. Their love was not a tempestuous, all-consuming fire, but a steady, warm hearth that they tended together. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared vulnerability, and a deep understanding of the healing power of compassion. Ilara had come to Blackwood Manor as a sacrifice, a transaction to save her family. She had expected a life of cold, lonely duty. But in the heart of winter, she had found an unexpected spring. She had taken the initiative, tending a neglected garden, and in doing so, had tended a neglected heart. She had reached out to a silent child, and in teaching her to speak again, had given a grieving man the words to finally heal. She had been told she owed him nothing, but in giving freely of her kindness, her patience, and her love, she had gained everything. She had found a home, she had found a family, she had found a love as deep and enduring as the granite cliffs on which their new life was built. 1 year later, the rose garden at Blackwood Manor was in glorious, defiant bloom. The air was heavy with the scent of damask, moss, and sweetbriar, a fragrant testament to a season of dedicated care. Ilara sat on a stone bench, a book lying forgotten in her lap. watching as Alistair pushed a laughing Rosalind on a swing he had hung from the sturdy branch of an ancient oak. The sound of his daughter's delight was the new, true music of the house. His face, which had once been a mask of stone, was now open and expressive, capable of 1,000 small smiles and tender glances. He caught Ilara's eye over Rosalind's head, and the look that passed between them was one of such profound, quiet love that it needed no words. He had become the man he was always meant to be, a loving father, a thoughtful lord of the manor, and a devoted husband. The house behind them was no longer a fortress of grief. Its windows were thrown open to the sea breeze, and sunlight streamed into every corner. The west wing was now their family wing, its once haunted rooms filled with the cheerful clutter of a child's toys, and the scent of the flowers Ilara arranged in every vase. The portrait of Isabel still hung in its place of honor, no longer a shrine to a painful past, but a gentle reminder of the love that had first laid the foundations of their family. She was a benevolent, smiling ancestor now, a part of their story, not the end of it. Ilara rested a hand on the gentle swell of her own stomach, a new secret, a new promise of life stirring within her. She had not yet told Alistair, saving the news for this perfect summer evening. Their family was growing, their roots sinking deeper into the rich soil of Blackwood. Rosalind's laughter pealed again as Alistair pushed her higher. "Higher, Papa, higher! To the moon, my little star," he replied, his voice full of a joy that still, after all this time, made Ilara's heart ache with happiness. He brought the swing to a gentle stop and walked over to Ilara, sitting beside her on the bench and taking her hand. Rosalind ran off to chase a butterfly, a flash of white muslin against the green lawn. "A year ago," Alistair said, his voice a low murmur, "I could not have imagined this. I did not believe I deserved to." "We all deserve happiness, Alistair," she replied, her fingers tightening around his. "Sometimes we just need a little help clearing away the weeds to find it." He smiled, that slow, beautiful smile that was hers alone. "My clever, wise Duchess, my gardener." He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, familiar gesture that still held the thrill of a miracle. "I love you, Ilara." "And I love you," she whispered against his lips. She had come to Blackwood expecting a prison, and had found a kingdom. Not a kingdom of wealth and title, but one of love, healing, and second chances. The arrangement had been cold, the terms absolute, but a heart, she had learned, does not obey the terms of a contract. It follows its own laws, and in the quiet, patient work of compassion, it can coax even the most desolate landscape into bloom. The man who had claimed she owed him nothing had, in the end, given her everything that truly mattered. Dear listener, how often do we encounter hearts that seem closed off? People who have built walls of ice around themselves to guard against past hurts. It is so easy to see that coldness and turn away, to accept the terms they present to the world. "I need nothing from you. You owe me nothing." We take them at their word, respecting the boundaries they've drawn, and in doing so we sometimes leave them in the very isolation they both crave and fear. The story of Ilara and Alistair is a powerful reminder that the most formidable walls are often built of the most fragile materials: guilt, fear, and unresolved grief. And these walls are rarely breached by force. They are not conquered, they are dissolved, they are melted by the slow, steady warmth of quiet compassion. Ilara did not arrive with a plan to change the Duke. She did not demand his affection or try to tear down his defenses. Instead, she simply began to tend the garden. She brought life to the neglected corners of his world, not for his sake, but because it was in her nature to nurture. She offered kindness to his child, brought order to his home, and created beauty in a place long bereft of it. She showed up, consistently and gently, with a quiet strength that respected his pain without accepting his decree of hopelessness. In our own lives, we will meet people who are lost in their own winter. Our first instinct may not be to offer them our hand, especially if theirs is cold, but perhaps the greatest gift we can give is to simply start tending the garden nearby, to bring a little warmth, a little life into their orbit without demand or expectation, to show them through our own quiet actions that beauty can grow again, even after the harshest frost. For it is often not the grand declaration that heals a wounded soul, but the persistent, gentle whisper of compassion that says, "You may not need me, but I am here, and I see the life that is still waiting to bloom." Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more tales of love, loss, and the quiet resilience of the human heart.